The Vice Chancellor, Dr. Nadimul Haq, will join us later. So before that, I will moderate this session. So today's our webinar is Adaptation, Modernization and Productivity, the Role of Agriculture Finance. We have three panelists, Mr. Fida Muhammad, who is Country Program Officer, Pakistan International Fund for Agriculture Development, IFAD. IFAD has a long contribution in promoting agriculture productivity, where IFAD is working with the public sector as well as with various NGOs in Pakistan, particularly in the northern areas. Our second speaker is Mr. Kashif Umar Tanwai. Kashif Saab is COO, Recult Pakistan, and he has a long history again related to digital finance, and he has worked in various countries like Thailand, Vietnam, etc., etc. He has also served in Angro. So we have a vast experience. We have two professional, practical panelists who are part of the policymakers in Pakistan. And I will set a certain stage from the academic side on this our topic. So I have a short presentation. So my presentation will cover basically related to this topic, including adoption, modernization, productivity, and where right now we are standing in agriculture sector. So first, we know the importance of agriculture. You know that right now it is contributing 1/5 in GDP, and still it is the main sector for providing the livelihood. Still 43% of the employment that is concentrated in agriculture sector. We also know the importance of agriculture. You know that almost 50-60% of our export that are directly and indirectly linked with the agriculture. But the real challenge is that still agriculture is not helping in reducing poverty and hunger. For example, if we look the poverty, still it is concentrated in pure agriculture zones, like in southern Punjab, like in interior Sindh, and where we have cash crops. Unfortunately, poverty is less in Barani areas like in northern Punjab. So poverty is highly linked in those areas that are purely agriculture zones. Second, we are facing high rate of food insecurity. Right now, more than 20% of our population that is food insecure. And you know that recently we have faced a flood where more than 33 million population that has been affected. Another issue related to the food insecurities, you know that we are among the highest countries that are facing the issues of malnutrition. 38% children right now, they are facing this stunting. And whenever we talk about food insecurity, we have three dimensions of food insecurity. First is food should be available. And you know, इस वक्त पाकिस्तान में there are a lot of areas जहाँ पे आटा नहीं मिल रहा है. So availability is the challenge. Second is affordability. Again, you know that 40% right now we are facing the food inflation. So food might be available, but mostly the lower middle class, the poor, it is beyond their purchase. And third dimension is stability. That food should be available, food should be affordable, and people can afford it over the long period of time. Another issue right now, we are facing the high losses and wastage. Around 8% of our food that is losses at production level. And 30% is wasted after harvesting. Supply chain में लॉस होती है, स्टोरेज के अंदर लॉस होती है, आपके घरों के अंदर लॉस होती है, और इस वक्त 36 मिलियन टन फूड लॉस हो रही है, जो कि आपकी कराची, हैदराबाद और लाहौर की पॉपुलेशन खा सकती है. इतनी लॉस हो रही है. एक तरफ अवेलेबल नहीं है, malnutrition है, और दूसरी तरफ हमारे हाई लॉसेज है. और जो एक और चैलेंज है, दैट इज कि डाटा ऑन एग्रीकल्चर इज मिसिंग. Last census on agriculture machinery that was conducted in 2004, livestock census was conducted in 2006, and agriculture census that was conducted in 2010. Second, ये losses आपको मैं दिखा रहा हूँ, so you can see कि we have 30% losses right now. Another challenge is that कि जो हमारी 5 major crops हैं that have 80% contribution in the agriculture, growth is highly volatile. So our growth is not constant over the time. यस, प्रोडक्शन ओवर टाइम बढ़ी है। अब देखिए, जब भी आपकी प्रोडक्शन बढ़ती है तो उसकी दो रीजंस हो सकती हैं कि एक तो ये है कि आपका जो कवर्ड एरिया है वो बढ़ रहा है, एंड सेकंड ये है कि आपकी जो टोटल फैक्टर प्रोडक्टिविटी है वो बढ़ रही है। तो पाकिस्तान का जो पहला चैलेंज अगर आप देखेंगे तो इन क्रॉप्स की, ठीक है, एनुअल प्रोडक्शन बढ़ी है, बट दैट ग्रोथ रेट इज नॉट सफिशिएंट कि जो आपकी पॉपुलेशन की नीड को पूरा करे। वी हैव ए 220 मिलियन पॉपुलेशन, एवरी ईयर 40 आपके लाख माउथ बढ़ रहे हैं। तो ये 40 लाख माउथ के मुताबिक आपकी जो प्रोडक्शन है वो इंक्रीज नहीं हो रही है, एंड मेनली ये जो प्रोडक्शन आपकी बढ़ रही है दैट इज कमिंग फ्रॉम कि आपका एरिया ओवर टाइम इंक्रीज हुआ है, एंड स्पेशली पिछले 20 साल में जहां पे ग्लोबलाइजेशन हुई है, जहां पे आपकी मॉडर्नाइजेशन हुई है, टेक्नोलॉजी इंप्रूवमेंट हुई है, unfortunately our productivity over the last 20 years that is most stagnant, and you can see we are losing our comparative analysis। हमारी जो पर एकड़ यील्ड है वो सिर्फ कॉटन में बेहतर है, बाकी आप वीट में देखें तो जो इंडिया है वो हमसे तकरीबन 6-7 टाइम उसकी प्रोडक्टिविटी ज्यादा है, एंड सेम यू कैन सी इन मेज, सेम यू कैन सी इन शुगर केन। सो और अगर हमारी प्रोडक्शन टोटल फैक्टर प्रोडक्टिविटी से आए, सो दैट शुड बी बेटर कि आप थोड़ी इनपुट से ज्यादा आउटपुट ले। और आप देख सकते हैं कि 60s में जो हमारी प्रोडक्शन थी, एग्रीकल्चर ग्रोथ थी, दैट वाज इमर्जिंग फ्रॉम टोटल फैक्टर प्रोडक्टिविटी, बट ओवर द लास्ट 3 डिकेड्स जो हमारी एग्रीकल्चर ग्रोथ है दैट इज मेनली ड्राइविंग फ्रॉम कि आप इनपुट को इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं या आप एरिया इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं। आपकी जो प्रोडक्टिविटी है, इकोनॉमीज ऑफ स्केल है, दैट आर नॉट हैपनिंग इन द एग्रीकल्चर सेक्टर। वाटर अवेलेबिलिटी हमारी कम हो रही है, दैट इज अनदर चैलेंज। अच्छा, एक और जो चैलेंज हमें आ रहा है कि आपका देखें, आपके एक छोटे फार्मर्स हैं और पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त आप देखेंगे तो मोर देन 70% आपके जो फार्मिंग है दैट इज स्मॉल स्केल फार्मिंग, दैट पीपल होल्ड ओनली 1-2 एकड़ लैंड। लेकिन आप देखें, पहला आपको इस स्लाइड से दो चीजें आपको मैसेज मिल रहे हैं। नंबर वन, 1990 में और 2010 में पाकिस्तान में फार्मिंग का पैटर्न कोई बहुत मेजर चेंज नहीं हुआ। और नंबर टू, जो छोटा फार्मर है और बड़ा फार्मर है उनके भी बिहेवियर आपको सेम मिल रहे हैं। हालांकि बड़े फार्मर के पास इकोनॉमीज ऑफ स्केल होती हैं, क्रेडिट हो सकता है, उसके पास मशीनरी अवेलेबल हो सकती है, लेकिन उसका भी बिहेवियर वही है जो एक छोटे फार्मर का है। हमने अभी एक स्टडी कर रहे हैं 4 कंट्रीज में, इंक्लूडिंग इन चाइना, इन बांग्लादेश एंड इन इंडोनेशिया, एंड दैट कॉन्सेप्ट इज रूरल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन। पहले कॉन्सेप्ट होता था रूरल एरिया में कि आपने पॉवर्टी एलिवेट करनी है। Now there is another concept that is rural transformation. So basically rural transformation have 2 indicators. One is RT1. RT1 is basically shifting from low yield crop to high yield crop. तो पाकिस्तान में अगर आप देखें तो हमने जो पिछले 40 साल का एनालिसिस किया है उसमें यह है कि हमारी लो यील्ड से हाई यील्ड पे हम शिफ्ट नहीं हुए। स्टिल अवर फार्मर इज मैनेजिंग ग्रेन क्रॉप्स, और जो एग्रीकल्चर के अंदर आपको मिल भी रहा है थोड़ी बहुत, वो मिल्क है, लाइफ स्टॉक है, बिकॉज लाइफ स्टॉक इज कंट्रीब्यूटिंग 2/3 विद इन द एग्रीकल्चर। सेकंड जो रूरल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन का इंडिकेटर होता है दैट इज शिफ्ट फ्रॉम एग्रीकल्चर टू नॉन एग्रीकल्चर। और अगेन आपका कोई बहुत मेजर शिफ्ट नहीं है कि जी के नॉन फार्म जो आपकी एक्टिविटीज हैं दैट शुड बी इमर्ज्ड इन द रूरल एरियाज। और लोगों के पास, क्योंकि एग्रीकल्चर इज स्टिल क्राउडिंग, एग्रीकल्चर इज कंट्रीब्यूटिंग 20% इन जीडीपी, बट एम्प्लॉयमेंट शेयर उसका 43% है। तो इसका मतलब है कि वहां पे बहुत ज्यादा आपकी अंडर एम्प्लॉयमेंट एग्जिस्ट कर रही है। तो अगर आप लोग वहां से निकाल भी देंगे तो इट विल नॉट कंप्रोमाइज योर एग्रीकल्चर प्रोडक्टिविटी। और अगेन हमारे पास कोई बहुत अच्छा रूरल ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन में भी नहीं आ रहा है। सो नाउ वी शिफ्ट टुवर्ड जो हमारा आज का एक है जो टॉपिक है दैट इज एग्रीकल्चर फाइनेंस। तो हमारा चैलेंज क्या है एग्रीकल्चर क्रेडिट में? नंबर वन, वी डोंट हैव अ क्लियर एग्रीकल्चर क्रेडिट पॉलिसी। अभी रिसेंटली स्टेट बैंक ने 2022 में क्रेडिट पॉलिसी बनाई है, एंड उसके रिजल्ट टाइम लगेगा, बट प्रीवियसली वी डोंट हैव एनी क्रेडिट पॉलिसी. ZTBL बैंक इज एग्जिस्टिंग ओवर द लास्ट 5-6 डिकेड्स, लेकिन उसकी पॉलिसी मोस्टली कैटर करती है लार्ज फार्मर को. और आप डाटा देखें तो विद पैसेज ऑफ टाइम पाकिस्तान में आपके स्मॉल फार्मर्स इमर्ज हो रहे हैं ड्यू टू लैंड डिवीजन. सेकंड जो चैलेंज हमें आ रहा है वो ये है कि एग्रीकल्चर जो क्रेडिट अमाउंट है, ऑल्दो इट इंक्रीज ओवर टाइम, इस वक्त तकरीबन को 136 बिलियन था 2021 में जो क्रेडिट डिसबर्स हुआ है, बट अगर आप इसको शेयर देखें एज ए परसेंटेज ऑफ प्रोडक्शन तो ये बहुत थोड़ा सा अमाउंट है. सो स्टिल अवर फार्मर वो आपके जो आपके इनफॉर्मल लोन्स हैं वो मोस्टली उसी के ऊपर रिलाय करता है. जो थर्ड अगर आप देखें तो जो हम क्रेडिट दे भी रहे हैं दैट इज अ क्यूरेटिव ट्रेंड है उसमें कि जस्ट आपने प्रोडक्शन पे देना है. फॉर एग्जांपल उसमें अगर आप देखेंगे तो आप पेस्टिसाइड्स पे नहीं है, फर्टिलाइजर पे सब्सिडी दे देंगे, फ्लड आएगा तो आप उसमें रिबेट दे देंगे. देयर इज नो स्कीम कि आप एग्रीकल्चर के अंदर प्रोडक्टिविटी फोकस हो. लाइक जिस तरह मैंने पहले भी बताया कि वी आर फेसिंग वाटर शॉर्टेज, तो आपको ड्रिप इरिगेशन चाहिए, आपकी सीड हो, इनोवेशंस हो, और जो सबसे पहले हमने शुरू में कहा कि वी आर फेसिंग फूड लॉसेज एंड वेस्टेज, तो आपके पास एक इंटायर वैल्यू चेन हो सकती है कि जिसमें आप अपने कोल्ड स्टोरेज कैपेसिटी इंक्रीज करें, आप अपनी वैल्यू चेन को एनहांस करें कि जिससे आप अपने जिसको कहते हैं अपनी कैपेसिटी को इंक्रीज कर सके. सो स्टिल वी डोंट हैव मोर लोन के जिसमें आप प्रोडक्शन यानी डेवलपमेंट की तरफ जाएं, कारपोरेट फार्मिंग की तरफ जाएं. दैट इज अनदर इशू. और फिर देखें एक इनेबलिंग इन्वायरमेंट होता है कि जिसमें आप क्रेडिट अगर देंगे भी तो वो क्रेडिट काम करेगा. तो पाकिस्तान में जिस तरह पाइड अक्सर कहता है कि वी आर मिसिंग द मार्केट्स. मार्केट क्या होती है कि जहां पे इंफॉर्मेशन हो. ZTBL बैंक हैव मोर देन 2000 ब्रांचेस, लेकिन आम फार्मर से पूछेंगे तो उसको पता ही नहीं है कि लोन का प्रोसीजर क्या है, कहाँ से लेना है, उसके लिए डॉक्यूमेंटेशन क्या चाहिए. सेकंड, अगर आप रूरल एरिया में देखें तो मार्केट मिसिंग है. फॉर एग्जांपल आप देखें कोल्ड स्टोरेज है मोस्टली दिलैत, वेजिटेबल मार्केट नहीं है. सो अल्टीमेटली अगर फार्मर कोई लोन ले भी लेगा तो दैट वुड बी कंप्रोमाइज. सो आई विल स्टॉप हियर by setting this stage, and I will invite Mr. Fida that you further talk on the agriculture finance, that how is it is happening in Pakistan and what IFAD is doing right now. Fida sahab.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shujat Farooq Saab. I think you have set the stage very well with respect to the topic. And I would reflect a little bit on the areas that you have already touched upon. And you have very rightly said that. I think you have rightly said that agriculture is not helping us. But I would say that we are also not helping agriculture and the people around it. So when we talk about the figures that you have just shared a while ago, I can see over the last 2 decades, for example, that agriculture sector has actually experienced low growth rate. And when we look at the compounded annual growth rate, it is only around 2.5%. And it is based on the 2005 and 2006 prices. While the GDP itself has grown much stronger than this, around 4.1%. And this was primarily driven by growth in services and also the industrial sector of Pakistan. So it's already an indication that your agriculture sector is not performing really well. You have also very rightly referred to the yields that are not increasing, and instead, the gain we are making in terms of production is primarily extending our production base and bringing more area under cultivation, or there is some substitution happening. For example, more area is going towards the staple crops, and that is the main reason for increase in production. If we look at the other player globally, primarily production increase is driven by increase in yield, and this ratio is about 7 to 75% in other countries. and only 25 to 30% of this increase should be driven by increase in area, which is not the case in Pakistan. You have also very rightly referred to the food security challenges that the country is facing. And in this context, I would stress upon the fact that there is a leap forward in yield required. For example, if Pakistan needs to meet the staple food need by 2032, and we assume the current population growth rate, we would need 42 million tons. And from the current 9 million hectares that is under wheat cultivation, the yield should be increased exponentially. And the figures you have shared, which is for China, I think we have to catch up the yield in terms of wheat production of China around 4.7 to 5 tons per hectare, which is currently at around 2.9 tons in Pakistan. Again, you have referred to the post-harvest losses. Yes, significant losses are happening. And in some cases, it's up to 40%, or as you mentioned, 38%, which is a significant loss. Now, coming to the how we can help agriculture. And I think you have rightly set the stage that most of the farmers in Pakistan are smallholder farmers. And they have major issue with respect to access to credit. And the question you have posed for me was access to credit. Today, I think 5% of the private sector credit in Pakistan is extended to the agriculture sector. And these around 3 million loans do not include smallholder farmers, whereas the smallholder is the absolute majority in the country, 82% or more farmers. And you have shown the trend that small farmers are increasing. So this has to change. And again, you have also touched upon a very relevant point, which is with respect to the interest rate in the country and the affordability, which is absolutely not in line with the productivity in the agriculture sector and the current profitability of the farmers. Now, we have left the farmers at the mercy of the artis, the middle person, the intermediaries in the market chain, who supply them with the credit, but it locks the sale of the farmers of all the commodities they produce. And then the credit is actually extended also to the supplier in the change. So there is one aspect is to increase the access to credit, and you have rightly pointed out towards the use of digital technologies, mobile money, etc. Now, looking at the other fundamentals in the chain which affect productivity and also the viability of the smallholder farmers. This is the rupee share that they get from the market. Globally, today, less than 6.5% of the consumer rupee actually goes to the smallholder farmers when you eliminate all the costs and the cost of input. So the farmer get only 6.5% of the final price, which is a fact, and it has to change if we want to increase investment in agriculture sector. The second aspect is the global investment that is, and also it is very much linked to the topic, which is the adaptation. Today, less than 2% of the climate finance is actually going to the smallholder farmers, and who are at the highest risk level from the climate change and other shocks that are realizing today. So this also draws the attention of the international communities to invest more in adaptation and climate change related financing. So I would summarize that not only commercial financing, but also development financing has to increase in agriculture sector, and the focus has to shift from production at the corporate level, and it should also include smallholder farmers and the spectrum of assistance that is going to change. Over to you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you, Fida Saab. Thank you. We will back to you uh, after listening the Kashif Saab. Kashif Saab, how we can formalize this agriculture credit market? Right now it's mostly informal, where the farmer is dependent on artis and middlemen. There is agriculture credit policy by State Bank. Can you also highlight its salient features? And second, how we can divert the agriculture credit toward R&D, because R&D is our should be our key priority, because we are facing certain challenges in total factor productivity value chain. And second, how we can improve the supply chain. You know that right now we have production, but we lack proper markets. Pasco is there, food provincial departments are there, but still we are facing food insecurity, especially you can see there is shortage of wheat, etc. So Kashif Saab, can you highlight all these points, please, in your...
Assalamu alaikum all, and thank you, Dr. Shujat, for setting the stage, and lovely hearing Fida Saab from IFAD. I have noted some of the questions that, or some of the points that you have highlighted, but I would appreciate that before diving into what you have highlighted, Dr. Shujat, I would just want to kind of set the context. And in doing so, I have penned down a few points, discussion points, to set the baseline. So what I'll do is I'll just share my screen and then highlight. I'll just talk about the points that I have thought about. And the points that I want to talk about are: what exactly is the situation globally? I think it's important to understand first if it is a Pakistan specific issue or it is going across the globe. Number two, I would definitely want to respond to Dr. Shujat, your points about financial inclusion. What are the realities? What is not a reality? Some contours of the State Bank agriculture credit policy and what exactly is happening there. Then I would want to talk about farmer financing and what the realities on ground are. And I think it's also important then when we talk about problems, we also try to set the stage for the way forward, as highlighted by both Fida Saab and yourself. Now, if we look at the global perspective, there are about 600 million farmers worldwide. And more than 80% of those farmers are smallholder farmers. And I must highlight here that access to finance remains a global problem. It is not Pakistan specific. But does that mean that we should get complacent? Not at all, of course. Why? Because while this challenge is global, in our case of Pakistan, this issue is even more severe. I'll just give you an example of our neighboring country, India. The financial inclusion rate in India is 30%. Now, what does that mean? It means that 45 million farmers out of 150 million farmers in India have access to formal financial credit. I'll talk about the reason of what and why is this difference between India and Pakistan in the coming slides. But right now, I'll just focus on the facts. From a Pakistani perspective, the number of farmers who have access to formal financial credit is less than 15%. Now, this gives us a very good baseline of where do we stand. Another important point before diving into the credit contours is that what exactly is the level of financial inclusion on an overall basis in Pakistan are. The gold standard across the globe to evaluate financial inclusion is the World Bank's Findex report. And according to that latest report, only 21% of adults have a bank account in Pakistan. Now, this is a demand side survey, and this gets substantiated by a fact that Pakistan's deposit to GDP ratio is alarmingly low at 26%, which means that there is a significant amount of cash in circulation, which is not becoming part of the banking system. If I compare this 26% deposit to GDP ratio with India, there it is 75%. Even for that matter, in Bangladesh, it is 50%. Now, from a deposit, let's move on to the lending to GDP ratio. And if we look at the lending ratio in the developing countries, it is in the north of 50 to 60%. And for the developed countries, it is more than 100% of the GDP. However, in case of Pakistan, the lending to GDP ratio is around 15%. Now, it is also important to comprehend that an already low lending rate or lending inclusion is skewed towards the larger firms and not to farmer financing. And I would just want to elaborate on that with numbers. If we look at the latest numbers of lending, the whole banking industry in Pakistan has lent around 12 trillion rupees. This includes everything. This includes corporate lending. This includes commodity financing. This includes consumer financing. Now, to put it in percentages, 80% of this has gone into corporate finance, which means that these are the loans which are given to a few companies. I would say that the number would be around 2 to 300, and it has been given to them. 10% of it has gone into commodity financing. Dr. Shujat, you referred to wheat procurement. So 10% of that amount has gone into commodity procurement, more specifically wheat. And 10% of it has been into consumer financing, the auto loans, the credit cards, the personal loans. Now, unfortunately, less than 10% of the loans have been given into priority sector. That includes low-cost housing, that includes SMEs, that includes agriculture. Now, if I talk about agriculture, Fida Sahab highlighted a number, and I think that number was slightly higher. He mentioned 5%. I think the number is absolutely right if you look at the numbers in the historical perspective. Unfortunately, that number has come down to 3.5% as of now, if we look at the latest numbers of State Bank. So, which means that agriculture credit as a percent of total credit is now down to 3.5%. I would definitely want to again contextualize that what is the general percentage of agriculture credit in the developed economies, in the developing economies, as compared to this 3.5%. As Dr. Shujat mentioned, that agriculture contributes more than 20% to our GDP. However, agriculture credit as a percent of total credit is around 3.5%. In terms of a developed country, if we look at US, the contribution of agriculture is 1%, whereas the lending to agriculture as a percent of total lending is 2%, which means that it is double the size of what it contributes to agriculture in terms of credit. If we look into Thailand, where Recult is actively working, interestingly, the contribution of agriculture to GDP is 8%, and the credit to farmers as a percent of total credit is around 10%, which means that it is empirically proven that in our case, we are highly underserved in terms of farmer financing. And this point was highlighted by Mr. Fida and Dr. Shujat as well. I would definitely now want to slightly divulge from what we were saying to what Dr. Shujat pointed out about the structure of agriculture policy at State Bank and what exactly are the dynamics here. I think one thing that I would want to highlight is that the State Bank does not come up with an agriculture credit policy as such. They have a set of prudential regulations that were issued few years back. in terms of the regime that we are working, it's a voluntary regime whereby banks are free to lend or not to lend into the priority sectors. As a country, we were following a mandated regime till the year 2006, whereby mandatory targets were given to the financial institutions. However, post 2006, we have transitioned into an indicative target regime from a mandated regime, which means that the banks, though the state bank gives an indicative target to the banks, but the banks are free to lend whatever they want to. Now, it is also important to highlight that over the last 15 years, role of ZTBL has significantly reduced. Till about 15 years back, ZTBL was almost 70% of the total credit in agriculture. If we look at the disbursements number of last year, contribution of ZTBL has come down to below 10%. At the same time, a new set of institutions has come up in the last 20 years, which is the microfinance banks and microfinance institutions. They have been able to build a portfolio of about 250 billion rupees. Now, this number pertains to the December 2022 number, which at a comparative, on a comparative basis is quite healthy as compared to what the commercial banks are doing and what ZTBL has so far achieved. Now, I think it's important to highlight that, and I'll just refer to what Dr. Shujat mentioned, that the decades of 60s, 70s, and 80s saw a very robust agriculture growth that averaged around 4%. However, since the 90s, in the last 3 decades, agriculture growth has come down to less than 2%. And we can, of course, relate to that robust growth of 4% to the introduction of chemical fertilizer, to the building up of dams and water reservoirs that, of course, increased significant land under cultivation, as highlighted by Mr. Fida Muhammad. At the same time, there's a lot of mechanization, more so in terms of tractor production, that came into place. And then, of course, the Green Revolution, the Mexipark seed that was introduced in Pakistan in the 60s, that really helped to increase the production. However, the total factor productivity, unfortunately, has gone down despite the increase in total production, as highlighted by both Dr. Shujat and Mr. Fida. We also need to kind of comprehend to discuss the way forward, because on one side, it is easier for us to say that there are only 3 million farmers, which is less than 15% who have access to formal finance. However, we need to look at the other side of the picture as well, whereby the infected portfolio or the non-performing loans of the banking industry in agriculture is to the north of 15%, which means that the banks that are doing agriculture finance are actually incurring losses despite high markup rates. Now, what that means is that a bank is a custodian of deposits of the deposit holders. It is very important to deploy that capital in a prudent manner. Now, this brings me to a point of policy intervention by the government, whereby this challenge has been faced across the globe. Generally, the governments and the central banks have come up with 2 types of interventions. Either they have set very robust specialized institutions to further the cause of agricultural credit. For example, in the case of Thailand, the Bank for Agriculture Credit and Cooperatives takes care of more than 80% of the country's agriculture credit needs. Whereas in case of Pakistan, ZTBL is practically a dysfunctional organization with more than 40% of its portfolio infected by bad loans. Interestingly, as we talk now, it is still being run without a chief executive officer. So as we discuss the way forward, it will be very important for the policymakers to institutionalize this specialized institution, which should actually be an inspiration for the banking industry to further the cause of agricultural credit and serving the farmers, and more specifically smallholder farmers. The other way, or the policy tool that the governments have come up with globally, is the setup of specific endowment funds, which can uh, kind of encourage private sector to invest into agricultural finance. For example, in case of India, they have a Rural Infrastructure Development Fund, RIDF, and Dr. Shujat Farooq interestingly alluded to the fact that is there a way that we should, as a country, have this kind of a tool whereby we can encourage agricultural financing. So I think it's very much possible. For example, in the case of telecommunication companies, they contribute a certain percentage of their revenues to the Universal Service Fund, USF, to ensure that broadband infrastructure is deployed and replicated in the remote rural locations. Similarly, a rural infrastructure fund, you can name it anything, could be formed so that an enabling environment with a structured and targeted subsidy can be formed to target smallholder farmers. I'll also want to highlight the US Farm Bill, which actually takes care of their agriculture and food policies. Interestingly, that takes care of both the bad weather and the bad prices, which means the farmers are insulated from any adverse impact of either a climate change or, for that matter, any pest attack. Another important aspect that from a policy perspective, commodities as an asset class. In the developed countries and in the developing countries, there is a strong ecosystem around lending against agricultural commodities. Unfortunately, in case of Pakistan, except for the inefficient commodity financing, which we do, and that further distorts the market, there is practically no market-driven tool that can actually perform this function. Luckily, about a couple of years back, SECP came up with a guideline and rules for collateral management company, which is a foundational thing to create these commodities as an asset class. Now, there is a collateral management company that started functioning about a year back or about 18 months back. And now, for the first time in Pakistan, the commodity can be stored as a collateral and the banks can start lending against a commodity instead of taking agricultural land as a collateral. Again, we are in the initial stages of that policy tool. I think it will be very important for the policyholders to further encourage that policy tool. I think a couple of things that I would want to highlight, and then I'll hand it over back to Dr. Shujat, and then we can have an interactive discussion here, or we can respond to the questions, is about the regulatory sweeteners that can be given by State Bank to encourage commercial banks to play their important role. At the same time, I would also want to highlight that in our neighboring India, there are specialized rural banking institutions. In Pakistan, there is no such tool that is available. Now, what these rural banks, they do is that they are localized in a state or a few states, and they are able to enhance the outreach depending upon the ecology, depending upon the crops, because we need to understand that agriculture is hyper local. We cannot have a one size fit all approach, which means that we will be needing numerous smaller institutions focused on agricultural financing. Similarly, I think the 3C approach, which is corporate, cooperative, and contractual farming, this approach has to be encouraged. I think we don't have an option to go for one or two. We need to have an and approach, whereby there should be rules for corporate agriculture, there should be rules for cooperative agriculture, and there have to be rules for contractual agriculture, so that the banks can actually intervene and finance these farmers through different models, because in terms of contract agriculture, there could be a value chain model that can be built around it. In terms of corporate agriculture, it will become very easier for the banks to target those corporate agriculture clients. Of course, in terms of cooperative banking, which unfortunately in our case has not worked well, but I think it's high time that we start talking about it. Lastly, I'll just take a couple of minutes on the disruptions that technology is creating globally. Representing Recult here, Recult is the leading agtech in Pakistan, the only multinational agtech based out of US. We operate in Thailand, Vietnam, and Pakistan. It's important for us to understand that in the last decade or so, there are many models, legacy models, that have been transformed and optimized because of technology and data. I think one of the points that I wrote that Dr. Shudat highlighted was the lack of relevant and quality data. He mentioned about the last census that happened in 2010, agriculture census. He also highlighted that the last livestock census happened in 2006. Now, it is important that these agtechs, which actually are data companies focused on agriculture, they can bridge this gap, and not only the gap of data, they can synthesize this data. They are synthesizing this data, and they can reduce the intermediation cost of these banking institutions, financial institutions, and reduce the credit cost, and encourage these banks to be more active in the space of agricultural finance. Now, with this, I'll just stop here, and we can, I think, move on to either the questions or an open interaction. Thank you, Dr. Shujat.
Thank you, Kashif Saab. Thank you. I have one question from Fida Saab and two questions from Kashif Saab before getting question from the floor and the participant from the online. Fida Saab, IFAD is working, I think, in more than 20, 30 countries. Just in couple of minutes, please highlight what IFAD is doing in Pakistan. So just in terms of agriculture, productivity, modernization. Kashif Saab, I have two questions from you. You know that right now, we are taking entire agriculture as the informal sector. That stock market could be one source from where agri-based companies, they can collect certain funding. So right now, what is the situation in Pakistan where whether we have certain agri-based companies listed in stock market? Second, you have mentioned that there was a sole player earlier, that was the ZTBL, and right now it is losing share. And microfinance banks, they are emerging, and right now they have more than 200 billion portfolio investment. Whether this investment is contributing in modernizing the agriculture or not. So precisely in couple of minutes, Fida Saab, first you can respond, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sujat. International Fund for Agriculture Development, as you may all know, is a UN specialized agency which came into existence in 1978. And Pakistan has been the founding member of this organization. It provides loans and grants to developing countries, and today we have active operations in 40 developing countries, whereas its members are 177. So most members are actually contributing into the fund. In Pakistan, we started operation right after its existence in 1978, and until today we have implemented 29 investment projects, which together with the government and other financiers had a total outlay of 2.9 billion US dollar. And the number of projects has been 29. Today, the active projects are 5 in Pakistan. And as you have referred in the question with respect to what we do, actually, IFAD invests in rural people, and it's an organization which intend to transform rural areas and rural economies in a way that it is sustainably providing livelihoods to the rural people. And while we were discussing the adaptation, one of the adaptation strategy is to have alternative livelihood for the rural people. Since as Mr. Kashif also referred to the challenges with respect to agriculture, not only in Pakistan, but other countries. In many countries, agriculture is no more sufficiently providing livelihood opportunities. So we have a two-pronged approach. One, to sustainably increase the income potential from natural resources, and secondly, to invest in off-farm and non-farm livelihood options for the rural people, so that the pressure on natural resources is reduced, and also the resilience of the farmers are enhanced. Today, we have, if I sum up, in all our projects, we have projects from Gilgit-Baltistan to Gawadar-Lasbela. We have a project in South Punjab covering 10 districts, and we have a neat national project on national poverty graduation support. The total portfolio is around $700 million active portfolio, of which 450 million, 55 million is contributed by IFAD. And as I mentioned, two-pronged. It's the poverty graduation of the rural poor by providing them economic productive assets, so that they can derive income from that. And the second approach is to commercialize the smallholder farming in rural areas, and to connect them to the market in an agribusiness approach. And as Kashif mentioned, it's to take the supply chain, the value chain approach from end to end. And I liked when he referred to the 3 C's. While we are not working on the corporate side of it, but we certainly engage with corporate sector. We have a model called the 4P, the producer public-private partnership, where we engage with private sector for investment in smallholder farmers, where the private sector invests in the technology, in its own operation. We invest in the smallholder farmers. We strongly work on the other 2 C's. The cooperative farming, we are a big promoter of cooperatives in the country, and today we have established 230 cooperatives in Gilgit-Baltistan, and these are sizable cooperatives. And as Kasif mentioned, they need to be reinvented and reoriented. So we have a market-based, demand-driven, business plan based cooperative formation, which are having a size and scale. So minimum 300 farmers in a cooperative, having professional staffing, and we help them in acquiring technology, we help them in training, and we help them in connecting to the market. This model will be scaled up throughout Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. We will establish 550 cooperatives, again on the same model, and it will have together more than 200,000 farmers as members, and they will be connected to the market. We also promote contract farming, and as I mentioned, working together with the private sector, we connect them for market, integrating them in the supply chain, but also it pulls some investment from the private sector as well. So these are our operation, and I would strongly agree with Mr. Kashif when he mentioned about the use of, some disruptive technologies, like the use of digital channels. For example, in China, this 3-minute loan has actually unleashed the potential of many smallholder farmers, but also rural enterprises, which is also one area which needs to be catered in terms of financing. And when it comes to collateralization, I think we exclude the 2 big segments of the country, which is women and youth. Women and youth would never have land as a collateral unless, it's inherited. And we have to find ways that we decollateralize agriculture finance. Otherwise, we will still remain under 5% of this loan, which extends to agriculture sector. The other area which is very important, which we are now starting, is the credit guarantee schemes. And I think within agriculture, it is really important to de-risk the loan portfolio for the banks, but also combine it with the insurance and the protection that the farmer needs as well. So coupling up credit guarantee scheme with the insurance schemes is one area that we would like to support going forward. Again, climate finance and climate credits would be an area. Resilience building will be an area that IFAD will try to partner with the government of Pakistan going forward. Over to you. I think in the interest of time, I will
Thank
give
you. Thank you, Firas sir.
back to you.
Thank you. Kashif sir, your perspective on stock market role in promoting that financing agriculture, and second, that microfinance banks.
Yes, Dr. Shujat, I think you have come up with these. Both the points are quite important and relevant to the discussion that we are having today. In terms of the stock market, our stock market right now is essentially limited to large corporates. There is a mid-market window that they have opened, but if we look at the food and agriculture companies, I'll just take a name of the few companies that are already listed there. For example, Engro is there. For example, Nestle is there. Foji Fertilizer is there. Friesland Campina is there. And of late, slightly smaller companies like the Organic Meat Company and Al Shahir Corporation, they also got listed in the last 2 or 3 years. Having said this, these still are corporates. They are not SMEs, or they are not smaller companies. So small companies still don't have access to that window, unfortunately, which means that the access to capital in terms of not the debt, but the equity bit of it remains a challenge for them. Now, coming down to your second point that you have raised about the modernization, modernization possibly is the next level. Right now, if I look at the microfinance banks and microfinance institutions, all of this loan to the tune of 250 billion is essentially a working capital loan that is given to the farmers to purchase seed, fertilizer, pesticides. And then the best case scenario would be to purchase a tractor, or insignificant amounts go into tube well financing or drip irrigation. However, I don't see any financing within the microfinance banks that are targeted towards modernizing the agriculture. I hope this answers to your query.
Thank you. Thank you, Ji. So now floor is open for the question. I think first we can take the question from online. Kindly raise your hand and just mention your name and institution. Mahmood Khalid Saab.
Sir, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for putting up a very nice debate, because this is the need of the day, especially if we want to target one of the potentials of our future economic growth. I have questions for both of the worthy speakers, just for my clarity. First, from IFAD's perspective, what do you think that the target of agriculture sector in terms of production should be just the domestic food sufficiency perspective, or can we go towards export businesses as well? I'll just give you the reference of this question is that in today's news, the European countries are trying to cut down on the provisioning of the vegetables to the customers, because at the back end, the production has been halted due to the climate change, because of the energy non-availability and the off-season farm practices, which have actually changed. So can Pakistan tap in terms of these potentials which are happening around us because of the geostrategic positions or the climate itself, which is changing? This is the first question from you. Second, from the Kashif Saab, I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm more interested in terms of the mechanics of the financial inclusion of the agriculturists, because this is not like a normal credit and debtor relationship. It needs more qualification in terms of how the things, what vehicles would be used as collateral, and how the things are going to proceed. So in your perspective, do you think that the farmers should be the target, or can we think about somebody else in this whole supply chain. Maybe the Aarti himself, he can be the best person who should be facilitated, because he's the one who's going to act like a manager and a person who's going to ensure the credibility of the ones which are taking loans. And on top of that, they are also going to ensure where the funds are actually used, because the funds which are provided on directions are generally considered that they would have some rebate from the state bank or some kind of concessions. So often the people take the money because they are in that particular sector, but they are going to use it for some other perspectives as well. So maybe thinking loud, if we can target somebody in the whole supply chain where his stakes are also involved, because he's going to then process that stuff over and above the further supply chains, rather than targeting only the farmers. So that kind of practice in terms of loaning, would that help as compared to directly targeting the farmers? This is the question. Thank you very much.
Fida Sahab, can you respond the first question? And
Thank
Kashif
you.
Sahab, second,
Yeah,
please.
thank you, Khalid Sahab. Very pertinent question. I think the first, with respect to the target, I would say that we have a challenge for meeting the food and fiber requirement within the country. And as I mentioned earlier, just to feed our own population, we would need more than 40 million tons of wheat production in the country, which is itself a big challenge. And I mean, it roughly translates to 1 million ton production every year. This is one aspect. And when we look at it from the perspective of potential, I think there's a big potential in the domestic market for both traditional crops, but also the fruit, vegetable, and the changing dietary pattern in favor of meat and dairy products as well. So exponential increase in terms of production is projected, and it's a requirement within the country. You have very rightly pointed out with respect to the requirement in the international market, which is more in favor of high value crops. And that is linked also to the food safety and quality standard related aspect as well. So we have that potential, and Pakistan can tap it. But today, I think if we look, diversification has been very slow. In Pakistan, around 7-8% of land area is under high value crops. And this vertical farming under the tunnel, low, medium, and walk-in tunnels has been here, but sadly, I think there has been no product around it for financing product in the country, which can actually promote it. With this technology, I think we can certainly catch up to meet the domestic requirement, but also to meet the requirement in the international market. Today, if we compare ourselves, I mean, with 8% high value production, Israel is producing 77% horticulture crops, and China 40%. So huge potential, but it means that we catch up in terms of productivity in wheat and other crops, so that there's more land available. And we combine it with the vertical space that we can use through the tunnel technology. We can certainly earn foreign exchange, and we can create more jobs. And actually, youth can be engaged in agriculture through this modern technology. Over to you. Thank you. I hope I addressed the question in
Thank you.
optimal manner.
Kashif Sahab.
Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I think Mahmood Sahab, you've asked very interesting and raised very interesting points here. And I'll just build up on what Fida Sahab mentioned. You know, I think in our vision, we should have this export or net export of agriculture in our vision and as a long-term policy. In the short term, if I look at the numbers now, in the last 7 months, on a July 22 to January 23 basis, we have been a net importer of $7 billion in terms of agriculture commodities, which means that, again, what Fida Sahab mentioned, to begin with, we need to just make sure that our net balance is neutralized. and we become neutral in terms of imports and exports for agriculture. And if you just peel it, you will realize that, of course, our major imports or the major dollars that are spent consistently are either on palm oil or on tea, uh, uh, and then soybean, of course. And on an occasional basis, we face recurring shortages either of wheat or of cotton, or at times of sugar. Whereas we have been a very consistent exporter of rice. At the same time, if I look at if I look at the overall scenario, even in terms of livestock, I think there's a lot of room, because there's a market next door in the Gulf GCC, whereby they import a lot of their livestock from Australia or Brazil. We have a freight advantage, but again, I'll just use, and I'll use the term that Mr. Fida used, that first of all, let's focus on our own food, feed, and fiber in the short term or a medium term. Once we take care of it, I think it is good to have a vision of an export strategy in agriculture. Just to give you an example, Netherlands, a small country, is the highest agriculture commodity exporter, with a value of more than $100 billion. If they can do it, again, it's a wrong comparison. I don't want to draw an analogy, but I'm just trying that we can set a vision, keeping in view the countries which have been very progressive in this regards. Now, coming to the other point, this issue is very close to my heart. You just mentioned about the vehicles to be used for agricultural financing and inclusive agricultural financing that actually goes down to the farmer level. Now, this Aarti or the middleman or the intermediary or the input dealer or the output producer, not the output buyer, there are different shades of these intermediaries. And I'll be very candid here that there is a huge, I would say, misunderstanding in the minds of us, the policymakers, that this Aarti or a middleman is an evil. And at the same time, we consider the farmer as the angel. I think it's important to try to come up with an evidence rather than the ideology here, because I think you have raised a very pertinent point. There are good farmers, there are bad farmers, there are progressive farmers, there are not so progressive farmers, there are good intermediaries, there are bad intermediaries, there are exploitative middlemen, there are middlemen that are catering to the vacuum in the market that has been created. And I'll just go back to an example here. It's a market force that is created. So last year, when the unfortunate floods happened in essentially and more so in the province of Sindh, I can safely tell you that the financial institutions, they just pulled back. I was talking to the farmers and there in various districts, and they actually were running from pillar to post to get a financing arranged or to get their loans rescheduled. And one thing that was common was that in this hour of adversity, there was only one force that was there to hold their hand. And who was that? As highlighted by you, Mahmood Saab, it was that so-called devil Aarti, or the evil, who was actually holding their hand. And when there is a vacuum and there's a market, then it all boils down. And again, Dr. Shujaat can relate more to that. It boils down to the demand and supply and to the negotiating power of that agent which is there. Just to cut in the interest of time, the long story, we at Recult actually are aggressively working on this model, whereby we are in the process of leveraging this intermediary. I don't want to use the word Aarti because it has a negative connotation attached to it. So I'll use the word intermediary here. Now that can be an Aarti, that can be an input dealer, that can be a pesticide dealer, that could be a seed provider. So we are leveraging on the hyper local knowledge of these intermediaries, and based on that data that we provide, based on the socio-cultural connection that they have with the farmers, we are linking them with capital that is being provided by the banks. So I hope this responds to your question. At least it helps all of us to raise further questions and further debate on the goods and bads of this policy regime.
Thank you, Kashif Sab. Any question from in-person audience? Meanwhile, the online participants are requested to just raise your hand, please.
Thank
If
you
you have
very
any
much.
question.
It's really wonderful presentation. I'm not going to ask questions, rather commenting something. I mean, there are three basic points in order to transform the agriculture. Basically, first is the government should stop interference in the agriculture markets. Currently, for example, government is spending 200 billion rupees annually on fertilizer index subsidy. So I believe, I mean, that is not contributing anything in reducing prices at the consumer level. I have estimated that if you remove that subsidy on fertilizer, only a 5-member family have to spend almost 800 rupees per annum extra. So that will goes to, I mean, on the cost part. So that, which is nothing, I believe. So, but on the government part, it's a huge amount. So similarly, in terms of wheat, government spending almost 135 billion rupees annual to give the subsidy. I mean, by purchasing from farmers and then giving it to consumer, but it is not contributing anything, reducing prices at the consumer level. So currently, you can see the wheat that is being sold in the market is almost, I mean, 140 rupees, while Pasco is releasing at the cost of 65 rupees per kg. So, I mean, again, I mean, the benefit is not reaching to the consumer. So again, this interference is not beneficial for the people, but for the public. So similarly, the interference in, for example, water market is leading to inefficient cropping pattern of more water intensive crops such as rice and sugarcane. So not only this interference, also not restricting, I mean, not contributing, rather also it is restricting to, I mean, moving towards high value crops. Because when you are giving, I mean, assurance, price assurance to the farmer, for example, for wheat, why they will shift to edible crops and other high value crops. So same thing, I mean, happening. I mean, we are distorting market basically, which creates signals and lead to inefficient cropping patterns. So, I mean, that's the first thing to stop the government in the interference of the market. Second thing, that money that government is spending in terms of subsidies in different sectors, so that could be withdrawn and should be allocated to R&D. Currently, you know, in Pakistan, the expenditure on R&D is less than 1%, which is very, very low. By having that much investment, really, we cannot bring any significant change. That need to be increased because we are, I mean, allocating money in a wrong way. I mean, that subsidy which we are giving in terms of fertilizer, in terms of wheat, in terms of water, and that could be withdrawn and should be invested on R&D. So particularly, I mean, that will also not affecting prices. That is the point. That the objective of these subsidy is not reaching to the end consumers. So second basically is to increase the budget on R&D, and third basically we need to really establish the value chain of high value crops. That's, I mean, without establishing high value chains, I mean, even we are going to produce, but we cannot sell it in the international markets. So that is basically the missing linkages. And third, I mean, we are talking about the RT lot here. I think that is really more, I mean, efficient way for the farmers to get access to the credit. I mean, no bank has to think that how can they can improve their efficiency and can reduce the cost of the credit to the farmers. if they really want to occupy the market and want to have more space in the market. So thank you very much. With these comments, I think that's the only way that we can transform the agriculture sector.
Thank you, Dr. Ubaidullah. Any other question from?
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to congratulate Dr. Shujat Farooq and all other respected mentors and speakers. Sir, I want to know just that, is it important to identify that what type of loan is required for large farmer and small farmer? Like, if I would say, maybe a large farmer need financing for agriculture like tractor, but a small farmer just need to, a small subsidy or financing or fertilizer bag. That might be more effective for produce sustainably and increase their income. So should we look at it? So thank you.
Kashif Sahab, can you respond, please?
Yes, sure. I think, the question that has been raised by the gentleman is about the type of products that should be available. My 2 cents on this would be that irrespective it's a small farmer or a large farmer, these products should be available and accessible to the farmers. A large farmer could be in a need of a working capital line to purchase fertilizer, and maybe a small progressive farmer could be in a need of farm mechanization equipment. Having said this, directionally, as of now, our credit is directed towards working capital needs of the farmers. I think in order to encourage the mechanization aspect of farming, it will be important for the government and state bank to come up with better cohesive policies. Though they do have certain policies on drip irrigation, on solar tube wells, and recently they have also come up with a subsidized credit line for farm mechanization. But I think there's a further build-up that is needed to actually set the tone for a modern agriculture in the future.
Thank you. Any other question, please, from in-person or online audience?
I just want to add some comments. I had some experience to talk to a few agricultures in Sialkot. There were many World Bank projects that were implemented in Sialkot through the provincial government departments. So the government will provide the solar systems and the drip irrigation system to the farmer through some percentage. Farmer will share, but at the end of the project, there is no market for the if the farmer want to change it or replace the infrastructure in the fields. So what we need to do, particularly what government want to do, is other than providing new projects, the government should also establish the market for the ongoing projects, so that if there is some ongoing problem that farmers are facing, they could find the solution in the market. So that's why farmers are not that much comfortable with these short run projects. That's my comment. Thank you.
One thing more that I want to add, especially related to the, solars and in agriculture sector. So that is no doubt reducing the cost of irrigation, but on the other hand, it's quite imposing future risk on the future generation on the groundwater, because that should be linked. Basically, that kind of subsidy should be linked that with water saving technology. So only subsidy should be given to those farmers who are also adopting, attaching it with sprinkling or some other technology. Otherwise, water consumption will extremely increase, and that is quite high, very, very highly risky for the future generation.
There is no question. Thank you, Kashif Saab. Thank you, Fida. So we have the conclusion that still, that agriculture is an important sector, contributing 1/5 in GDP, providing employment to 43% of the population, but still it is informal. Credit access is quite limited, just only hardly 2 to 3% of the farmers Credit market is expanding, but mostly it is relying on subsidies. It is relying on just that micro banks, they are emerging, but they are giving loan to just fertilizers, etc. So this is a huge subsidized market. There is a state bank policy 2022, but that as Kashif Saab highlighted, that it is not a comprehensive policy. So we have to critically review this policy in terms of that, how we can formalize the agriculture sector in terms of the stock market. Companies should come at the stock market. Private bank should be merged. There should be one window operation. That as youth, that youth is working, especially the females are working, because that more than half of the females employment that is concentrated in the agriculture. 66% of them, they are unpaid family workers, but they don't have documentation, they don't have land entitlement. So that's why that is a huge area where we can promote females inclusion, financial inclusion, as well as employment inclusion in this sector. And then that micro banks are emerging, but still they are focusing on fertilizers. We need to modernize in terms of raising total factor productivity, in terms of rural transformation, where we should shift from grain crops toward the high yield crop. And lastly, that ultimately, if we could modernize this sector, then there could be certain backward as well as forward linkages between agriculture sector as well as the non-agriculture sector. And then we can provide a decent livelihood as well as poverty elevation in the rural areas where that 2/3 of the population that is residing. So with this wording, I say vote of thanks to Kashif Saab, Fida Saab, and all the online and in-person participants. Thank you.